Welcome to the Conservation Council's second election forum. We're really pleased to have you here tonight. We've still got some members joining, but we'll continue to get started. For those of you who don't make it this evening, there will be a recording of this event and we'll post that onto our Facebook page, our YouTube page, and link will be on our website. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Oakey. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Council ACT region. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement to country and to acknowledge that we meet today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and acknowledge the contribution that they have made and continue to make to life in our region. In particular tonight, when we're thinking about the natural environment, we'd like to acknowledge that they have an ongoing contribution to make and that we have much to learn about how to manage our natural environment by listening to First Nations people. I would also like to pay my respects to any other Aboriginal people who may have been able to join us this evening, and our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to start with some logistics first of the event tonight before I introduce our speakers. So firstly, if everybody can ensure that their microphones are on mute. We only have 55 participants here so far, but it's certainly the noise adds up if all of the microphones are on. My apologies for our small technical hitches at our end, which I'll have to go and resolve a few of those. The structure of the event is that we have some pre-developed questions that we have ready for the candidates. And also that if people have other questions, we'd request that you pop them into the chat bar. And Maddie, who is on the top left of my screen, Maddie, if you would like to wave, our campaigner from the Conservation Council office, will be cutting and pasting the questions so that we can sort them out. And if there's lots of them, we can sift through them, potentially amalgamate some of them, because we know that we're more than likely to run out of time, as we always do at these events, because there's so much discussion. If you have a specific question for a particular candidate, just please identify who that candidate is for. To the Conservation Council, for nearly 40 years, the Conservation Council has been advocating on behalf of our local environment, but also, as we all know, as local citizens, our global environment. And we campaign in the ACT and the region for a safe climate to protect biodiversity in our urban and natural areas, to enhance our waterways, reduce waste and promote sustainable transport and planning for our city. We advocate to governments and build widespread support with the business community and the general community to deliver environmental outcomes and put forward evidence-based solutions and innovative ideas for how we might be able to live sustainably. Okay, so I'm going to move to introducing our candidates today. We have 3 candidates who are able to be with us this evening, and we'd like to thank you very much for your time. We know it's a really busy time for you all and you're all working night and day at the moment. It's nothing quite like an election campaign to keep the adrenaline going. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Minister Mick Gentleman from ALP. Mick, can you?
Yeah, here, Helen. Nice to be with you.
Mick is the current Minister for Environment and Heritage, albeit that we're in caretaker, and is a candidate for the ALP in Ginninderra. Our second speaker is Elizabeth Lee. Elizabeth, there, yep. Elizabeth is the Shadow Environment Minister from the Canberra Liberals and is a candidate in the electorate of Kurrajong. And our third speaker is Jo Clay. Jo's waving there, you can see, yep. And Jo is the spokesperson for the environment from the ACT Greens and a candidate in the electorate of Ginninderra. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I'd like to just quickly frame the issues that are facing us and the challenges that are facing us in and around biodiversity and waterways. Our biodiversity faces many threats, and yet here in the ACT, we are lucky to play host to some of the largest remaining important ecosystems in Australia, in particular grassy box woodlands, native temperate grasslands, both of which are now critically endangered. Our threatened species need high quality habitat in order to survive, and yet there are ongoing pressures with regards to urban development and the interface between urban developments and our natural areas. But we know that our trees, our waterways are vital for the health of our wildlife, our own health, as has been so clearly demonstrated over the last 6 months, where we've come to value our natural spaces perhaps more than we ever have, and plays an increasingly important role in developing climate resilience in the face of a changing climate. So I'm going to throw open to questions now and kick over to our first question. I've got somebody waiting in the wings for me over there. And pitch the first question to our speaker. Mick, I think I'll throw this question to you first, if that's okay, and then I'll come to Elizabeth and Joe, and then I'll rotate in terms of who gets to answer the question first. I'm going to shift my view. Okay, so the first question is, funding to support biodiversity across the ACT hasn't always been consistent or clearly allocated, and funding can be easily overlooked at budget time when there are competing demands. The ACT has many well-constructed and ambitious strategies and action plans to protect biodiversity across the territory, including the ACT Native Woodland Conservation Strategy and the Aquatic and Riparian Conservation Strategy, for example, that often aren't quickly and easily implemented. Over the past 2 years, a number of stakeholders proposed reviewing our funding model for biodiversity, and the Conservation Council's election priorities calls for an independent review of funding by the Environment Commissioner. So the question is, would you support this investigation? And if not, what are your proposals to improve the way that we fund work to enhance biodiversity across the ACT?
Thanks, Helen, and thank you for having me here tonight. It's been a pleasure, of course, working with the Conservation Council over the last 4 years, and I think we've worked well together in helping further environmental protection and conservation. Helen, I would say I respect that we've always adopted an evidence-based approach to our discussions. We haven't always agreed, but we've always been grounded in science, and we know that there's more to do, and I think this question reflects that. So I'm always open to finding better and more innovative ways to fund our environment. In the 1920 budget, we provided $126 million in recurrent funding for just 1 year for environment and climate change measures. The targets that the funding was to be used to achieve are set out in the outputs. For example, one objective was to implement the Native Conservation Strategy. And I think one of the things we can do better is to explain the work perhaps of EPSD and how the funding is being used. Often good work is done and we don't talk about it. So yes, in principle, happy to talk about that. I can say though that I think you'd only see this if you have a responsible and experienced government, and be careful of reviews being promised by a Liberal Party that is cutting revenue. So it's easy to promise things when they're not necessarily going to be held accountable.
Thanks, Mick. I'll throw to you, Elizabeth.
Sorry, thank you, Helen, and thank you to the Conservation Council, not only for hosting this forum tonight, but also for all the work that you do in terms of looking after our environment. And thank you for asking me to be part of this. There's no doubt that more can be done. And on that aspect, I think that I agree with Mick in his answer. Now, in terms of, for example, if you take the ACT Woodland Conservation Strategy, that was only released last year. So the question really does need to be asked about why we might need to even review that at all right now when it's only been a year old. And in terms of calling on the independent review for funding by the Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment, whilst I'm not opposed to it, we just need to be mindful that we respect the independence of the Commissioner and just make sure that we work with her to ensure that we find that balance of her retaining her independence whilst at the same time making sure that she's investigating issues that are of great importance to our environment and to Canberrans. And we would want to make sure that that balance is found. In terms of the strategy that is published, the Woodlands one, obviously it does have some great aims that we would support, and we want to make sure that that is done properly. So in theory, yes, Helen, I think that is something that we would support, but we want to make sure that we work with all stakeholders to ensure that we're taking that in the right direction.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'll throw to you, Joe.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for having me here tonight. Look, Helen, we're very keen in the Greens to make sure that this is the environment election that Canberra so clearly wants it to be. We are very serious about protecting our environment. I was really pleased to launch an $85 million repairing the land, repairing the waterways package recently with Shane. And we would support an independent review into funding. What we've noticed is that when Canberra does increase its protected habitat, it doesn't always increase the resources alongside that to ensure that there's enough conservation to protect that habitat. We've called for a commissioner review into our waterways as well as our environment, because we think that it's time to have a good look at that. And we've launched a big package of funded measures to try and repair our waterways. And the other thing that we have noticed that has come back to us very clearly through the community and the part care, land care and volunteer groups is we really need to make sure we've got long-term recurrent funding for all of the different groups that are working in protecting our habitat and protecting our different areas. We don't want to waste people's time constantly applying for new grants. We see that there's a lot of admin work in that. So we've actually really pinned a lot of these measures down into longer term, more fixed and recurrent funding so that people aren't constantly on that churn to try and seek funding for work that we all know needs to be done anyway.
Thanks, Jo. So I'm going to throw to a representative of one of our member groups and a member of our biodiversity working group, Sarah Sharp, to ask the next question. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks very much. It's terrific to have this opportunity to see where people are coming from with the election coming up. I wanted to ask a question about network of protected areas, and I wanted to see what your party thinks about how a protected network could work in the ACT to achieve improved conservation outcomes across the entire ACT landscape. And as part of this question, I'd like to actually see that as a relationship with the Commonwealth and all of the relevant ACT government departments that look after areas of land that have conservation value. So that includes roadsides, urban parks, little bits of odd unleased land and so on.
So, Jo, I might throw to you with that one first, if that's okay. Sorry, I'm going to rotate who gets to speak first. So.
That's all good. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Sarah. Look, it's complicated in Canberra, isn't it? Because we have ACT land, we have federal land, we have federal defence, we have federal Commonwealth land, we've got NCA. There's a lot of different authorities that we have to liaise with, and it would be absolutely ridiculous for me to tell you that as an ACT MLA, I would be able to go in with a big stick and fix all that, because obviously that's not how it works. We will feel our way through that. We would actually like to see better EPBC protection, which would apply to the lot. But again, unfortunately, that's federal. So that is just something that we will lobby on and work towards. We have in our big repairing the land package, we have got a lot of urban wildlife and biodiversity corridors marked out for protection to make sure we are linking in all of that habitat and protecting things. We do have a very strong compact city, no more urban sprawl policy to make sure that we are not constantly encroaching into habitat, which helps. And we've got a lot of funding and resourcing in our package to make sure that we have 10 new ranger positions so that they can do their jobs properly, more funding for PCS so they can work with all the agencies. We're talking to all the different groups working in here, and I'm hearing a lot of these problems with, you know, somebody over here is mulching and that causes weed seeds popping up here and then somebody else has to pull them out. There's a lot of coordination work that we can do, but there's probably no clear and easy answer I can give you, unfortunately, except that we will work hard on it because we think it's important and we have a bit of a sense of the complexities and all the different groups involved.
Thanks, Jo. I'm going to go to Mick next and then Elizabeth on this round, and then we'll go the other way next time around. So over to you, Mick.
Thanks, Helen. Well, we've made a commitment to not allowing new suburbs in sensitive areas, of course. We've talked about no new suburbs across the Murrumbidgee or Curran Forest as well. We want to develop and implement a Canberra-wide landscape strategy and action plan that, of course, guides our urban and non-urban environment policy and management, so we can continue to balance the city's growth with our wish to keep the bush capital, and building on the network of green spaces by identifying new areas where we can invest in our natural assets. So we're not just maintaining, but also improving the city's environment. So I think these are important statements to make, and there's an opportunity to work with the Commonwealth Government.
Mick's frozen for me. No, I'm frozen.
No, still going. So I think Professor Samuels has put some good ideas forward, and my approach to any reform of the Commonwealth is we must use the ACT standards are better. I think the current approval process at the national level deliver weaker environmental outcomes than those through the ACT system. So we also need to find a better way of working with offsets rather than offsets being found by proponents. Perhaps we could register or have a list to select from and work with a better, holistic protection, if you like. So these are things that I think we can work with together if we're re-elected.
Has Helen disappeared for anybody else? She has. Okay. Perhaps she's working on that, but whilst we're waiting, Maddie, are you happy for me to just give my answer and then?
That'd be great, Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so this is the perils of working with Zoom, I think, sometimes. So thank you very much for that question, Sarah. I guess it really does come down to and depend on what the council sees as how these network of protected areas would work. But for us, of course, in theory, we want to make sure that we do have protections for environmental significant areas in the ACT, and we will ensure that we work with everybody, including the Commonwealth and their different government departments and agencies, to ensure that the ACT's interests are always at the forefront. So it will really depend, and if there is going to be a network of protected areas, we'll need to make sure that we look very closely at how it'll be regulated, what it is trying to protect, and how those protections will work. So it is always about that devil in the detail, and we'll need to make sure that we work toward an outcome that will protect what it is wanting to protect.
Thank you.
Maddie,
yes.
It's Rod.
Hi, Rod.
Look, Helen's just having problems at the moment. It's Rod Griffiths, the President of the Conservation Council. I'm just going to take over just for a little while until Helen gets back online, and I'm going to throw over to Helen Sims to ask the next question.
Thanks, Rod. And I don't know, this would probably be going to Elizabeth first, would it? Yeah. Okay. In recent years, as an early step in the planning and development process, some developers have undertaken detailed ecological assessments in areas of potential residential development and have put in place comprehensive protective and enhancement measures. So that's as a very first step. This approach is in considerable contrast to the practice of minimum conformity with the federal EPBC requirements for biodiversity, and to undertake to introduce this practice as a matter of course in areas of government development would mean a substantial change in administrative culture. The question is, to prevent additional losses of increasingly at-risk biodiversity, would you be prepared to commit to such an approach?
Thank you for that question. And it's an interesting one because we obviously currently do have some processes and protections in place to ensure that environmental considerations are taken into account when it comes to planning. But if those processes, for whatever reason, are not working, then obviously that is something that we need to look at, because there is no point having processes and rules and regulations in place if they're not actually achieving what they are set out to achieve. This also does lend itself to the fact that we do need an overhaul of our planning system overall, and if we can enhance any protections that we can for the environment when it comes to looking at our planning processes overall, then that is a good thing.
I'm actually back, but not with a face. Sorry. Thanks. Can we throw to Joe with that question?
You sure can. Look, we do support that approach. We think areas with ecological significance should be protected before there's any more discussions about development, and that's a really good approach, so we definitely support it. And we've noticed, I think, like everybody else, that the EPBC and the current offsets policy aren't really getting that level of protection that they're meant to. So yes, protection first. And I just noticed a question in the chat box too of what the other parties think about no new suburbs developing west of the Murrumbidgee. And as I stated before, the Greens are no more urban sprawl. Let's stick to our current urban footprint. So hopefully that clears up our position on that one.
Okay, I'm going to throw to Mick, and then I'm also, yeah, you go, Mick. I'm assuming you haven't answered this one. I'm so sorry I had to drop out and I've just come back in. But
no, that's fine, Helen. Thanks very much. I think there's a range of doing things better, and this is one of them. So we've done some good things in this area. For example, reducing the size of developments to protect ecological sensitive and significant areas. We've also done other things like limiting lighting in areas to help superb parrot breeding around Throsby, for example, and deliberating design walking tracks to avoid pets entering the nature reserve. So, and we can build and do things better. I think the planning review currently underway is a good place to explore this, and I look forward to seeing all of you in this room help shape that review as well.
Great, thanks, Mick. I'd just like to take us back a step. One of the questions in that bar was around the urban development footprint, and certainly that's one of the questions that we also had on our list to ask you. And I just thought we might go back and get some clarity around that. So Joe, the areas that the Greens would support or not support, so basically the position is to stay within the current urban footprint, is that what you're
That is correct,
saying?
that is our position.
Okay. Would it be okay if I throw to Elizabeth on this? Oh, I've lost Elizabeth.
No.
Oh, there you are. Sorry. Can I throw to you on this, Elizabeth? What are the areas that the Liberal Party are talking about might be possibilities for future urban development?
Oh, look, Helen, like there's no doubt that obviously, as you've and the council has noted, there is a demand for housing in Canberra is growing. And we need to make sure that when we do it in a sustainable way. So I'm not going to be sitting here, and I'm not in a position to say we're, going to develop here and not develop there or anything like that. But we will have more to say in relation to planning in the next couple of weeks. And we will ensure that whatever happens in terms of planning, that we ensure that Canberra is growing in a sustainable way.
And Mick, did you want to add anything to that question? Because that was one of the questions that we were specifically putting, but you might not have touched on it in your last answer.
Well, yes, I do want to make some comment here. We've had Mark Parton come out saying that there is plenty of room to build and expand Canberra. He's indicated that he would bulldoze Cohen Forest, for example. So, this election is going to come down to a couple of votes in each seat, and there's a contrasting vision, I think, between what the Liberals are offering and what we're offering. And we're saying no to urban sprawl, to keep a tight and efficient city. And I think there's a strong contrast between what the Liberals are offering here. We listen to experts when we're planning our city, and to protect, of course, important box gum woodland. We've taken initiatives like reducing the size of Throsby, for example, from 4,000 down to 1,000 dwellings to ensure that we can keep that approach into the future. So there is some strong differences between the two major parties.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is actually touches on some of the issues around urban feral animals. in particular cats, which the Conservation Council has been campaigning on this issue in terms of the impact that cats have on native birds, mammals and small reptiles. And given the way that our suburbs are intertwined with and interfacing with nature parks right throughout the city. So currently the cat containment policy is that new suburbs that come online have got cat containment declared as a 24/7 policy where cats are required to be kept on the property of the homeowner. The ACT government's draft cat plan cited that free roaming cats in Canberra predated on about 61,000 native birds, 2,000 native mammals and 30,000 native reptiles, 6,000 native frogs each year. So while there's been a lot of work done progressing the policy response on the impact of cats on wildlife, and probably there's been, I would suggest, quite a shift in the public understanding of this issue and the importance of keeping cats contained. The question to the candidates is, does your party support Canberra-wide cat containment? And by when would you aim to implement it fully? I'm going to throw to Mick, and I'm getting back on my little list of who goes in which order. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Helen. Well, we have been working on the cat plan, as you said, and the work was impacted, of course, by bushfires earlier and then COVID. It's something that we need to keep talking to the conservation and also more broadly across the ACT community about. I think to keep the community or bring the community with us, we need to ensure that we have the right plan in place, I think, and the environmental sector needs to get the social license, I think, from the Canberra community to make the change. So that's the action item for you guys, I think, is to assist us to get that social license before we actually have it right across the ACT. I think the sector does a good job at engaging with the public and getting that license, and I've talked to Helen in private before about the opportunity to create an argument for change and get that social license to occur. But without those elements, I think we risk scare campaigns being run. So we often hear conservative groups trying to undo change. So we really need to get the whole community on board, I think, before we set a clear date.
Thanks, Mick. I'm going to throw to Elizabeth on this one.
Thanks, Helen. I think that we all can accept that there are risks to, obviously, feral animals and cats, especially in relation to our environment, and we want to make sure that obviously there is a protection in place. There is cat containment in many areas of Canberra, and we know especially in terms of the new areas. And in terms of obviously going to the existing suburbs, that is a bit more of a challenge about how that could be done. So it would actually make sense that we undertake an assessment about how the cat containment is working and what challenges might be faced in the event that we want to be rolling it out to the existing suburbs, and look at that before the program is rolled out.
I'm going to throw to Joe.
Thanks, Helen. Look, the ACT Greens first pushed government into introducing mandatory cat containment suburbs, and we're strongly committed to that. It's part of our public policy platform is cat containment, and we're committed to extending it Canberra-wide. The question, of course, is how you do that, and that is obviously raising some challenges in Canberra. Education, legislation and enforcement. We would like to actually push on for mandatory cat registration. We want better funding and resourcing for DAS so they can actually enforce what we already have. We want to extend cat containment further. That will be a mix of education as well as enforcement. There's no point if the laws are too far out ahead of community views, but we are strongly committed to this, and I've seen in Canberra how quickly our attitudes are changing. You look at how fast we all came on board with the end of the greyhound racing industry. We can actually adapt and change quite quickly once the case is made here. I'm also in touch with Michelle over at the RSPCA, and we're working with her on getting better cat desexing and more subsidised cat desexing, which will also reduce our problems. And as you know, the Greens also brought in made backyard breeding illegal. So that's also reduce the problems, but it's still an issue and we're going to work hard on it.
Thanks, Jo. I guess the ACT CAP plan actually outlined 3 different ways in which CAP containment could be implemented, including grandfathering clauses, setting a date, and potentially doing it suburb by suburb. And I guess the ultimate question is, at what point do we think we might have Canberra covered, no matter what the pathway is that we take to get there, whether it's, licensing cats and then saying all new cats need to be contained, or whether it's doing it suburb by suburb, or whether it's setting a date by which everybody abides by the law. So we look forward to hearing some specific commitments on it at some stage, because I think it's an issue that's been dragging on for quite a while. And I think particularly last year when the CAP plan was released, we did see quite a shift in community sentiment around it. And I think that you'd find that there are a lot of people who even are cat owners who are highly supportive of it at the moment. So it's becoming more normalised as the new suburbs come online. I'm going to throw to Esther from the National Parks Association. Esther, are you there? And I'll throw to you for your question around feral animals.
Okay, I'm on now. Yes, appropriate to a comment that was circulated by one of the group members a little while ago. Preserving all of these, or setting aside all of this land, isn't really too successful at protecting the environment unless we can do something about the weeds and the feral species, which can overrun or destroy the values of the nature and native environment. Plants like African lovegrass and Chilean needlegrass within the urban area are problems that need to be dealt with, and in the urban nature reserves as well. Current horse management policies in New South Wales present a challenge. And I would congratulate Minister Gentleman on the recent updating and restatement of the ACT feral horse legislation and plan of management for Namadgi. Implementing it is going to be the task. But also we have growing populations of multiple kinds of deer within Namadgi. So these are all ongoing management challenges. Can you outline how you would deal with this invasive plant and animal problem in the management of Namadgi and of the Canberra nature parks?
Jo, I'm going to throw to you first.
Thanks, Helen. Well, I think everybody knows where I stand on this. Feral animals have no place in our national parks, and as Esther was saying, just before caretaker, I released the updated horse management plan, and we've also been acting to help reduce deer, pigs and other feral animals in the park. We've instituted some new technology, cameras up into Namadgi to locate the deer when they come in, so the rangers are doing a fantastic job up there. I do want to thank Di and Esther and the entire National Parks Association for their tireless work on this, along with Reclaim COSI and the Invasive Species Council as well. Tackling feral animals is a key part of recovery for Namadgi. It's at its most difficult time, I think, at the moment. We've funded this program and will continue providing the funds needed for recovery and repair of the park as well. We have, of course, invasive plants coming in too that we need to manage, and I'm confident the rangers will do the best they possibly can with the funding we provide for them too. I'll continue my advocacy, of course, with both New South Wales and Victoria to get them to step up on their action as well, and continue that work. But I do want to give a little quote from Hansard. Many of you probably don't read it, but it is from Ms. Lee, where she says, "It is disappointing to see the Labor backbench take cheap digs at the New South Wales government and totally disregard the cultural significance of brumbies to this region of Australia." So I'd like to hear Elizabeth Lee's position on horses coming into Namadgi National Park.
Thanks, Mick. Elizabeth, I'll throw to you next.
Thanks, Helen. And in terms of weeds, there's no doubt that under ACT Labor, the management of weeds has really been out of control. So we want to make sure that we do support the groups and work with the rural landholders, especially in the south, who have come to us raising concern about the lack of management under ACT Labor of the infestation of African lovegrass in particular. We also want to make sure we support and work with volunteers who do a lot of work, making up the shortfall that has been left by government in relation to this space, and ensure that in government we would see that there is a better coordination between Parks and Conservation and TCCS when it comes to managing weeds. And when it comes to feral horses, we know that they do have an impact on our environment. There is no doubt about that. And whilst it's great for Mick to selectively quote Hansard, it is about ensuring that we respect the animal, but at the same time, protecting the ACT environment. I have always been very clear about that. And what we were told in estimates and annual reports hearings over many years from rangers and the experts who are looking in this space is that they have a good plan in place, and we will always support that and listen to our experts and our rangers when it comes to advice about management of feral horses.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So just to get some clarification around that, does that mean that there's not a blanket position around having horses in Namadgi, or would there be a clear position that you wouldn't support having horses in Namadgi?
No, of course not. And we have always said that yes, feral horses need to be managed, and we will ensure that we continue to listen to the experts and the rangers and their advice about management of feral horses.
Great, thanks for that. Jo, I'll throw to you.
Thanks, Helen. I've almost forgotten the question. So remind me if I go off track. Look, the Greens are very motivated to make sure that we are managing our feral pest, animal and plant species properly and our invasive plants properly. What we've noticed is there's often a short-term funding cycle, and that is no good for weeds. If you do it one year and you don't do it the next year, they grow back. So I think the biggest change we would make to what is currently being done is long-term, sufficient and recurrent funding to make sure that we're not wasting money and also allowing those problems to simply come back after a year or three when the money dries up. And that's most of the feedback that we've gotten from the parks and land managers confirms that you really need to commit to the program and continue it and make sure you roll it out on an ongoing basis. So we've costed out what we think we need to put into that. We've costed out more ranger positions. We've costed out more funding for PCS and for the park care and land care and volunteer groups that are doing this work. And frankly, most of us actually work in those groups. So we have a bit of an emotional commitment to doing the work too. I've been working my way around some of these groups and learning about the weeds. So we are pretty strongly committed to doing it.
Great, thanks, Jo. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question. This is about urban forest. Investment in our urban forest, both to improve urban amenity, but also to support biodiversity across the urban landscape is really important, and has obviously been a hot topic for discussion, and particularly in the face of climate change and building climate resilience, and also the knowledge that our urban forest is ageing and much of it is reaching the end of its lifespan. I'm conscious this question intersects with sustainability, urban sustainability issues, but we're also really conscious as a conservation organisation that there are real opportunities in developing our urban forest to think about biodiversity. So the question is, what commitment is your party making to developing our urban forest, and can you outline, and importantly for the group of people that are in the room tonight, how your commitment will support biodiversity across our urban landscape? I'm going to go to Jo first, and then Mick, and then Elizabeth, and then we'll go back around the other way. Thanks, Jo.
Sure. Thanks, Helen. We've launched a big Repairing the Land, Repairing Waterways package, which has a lot of funding and programs in to manage our urban forest. We want to manage it not as a series of trees, but an actual urban forest that provides year-round habitat and year-round food for wildlife. I'd note that there's not much point planting a million saplings if you're still allowing the developers to cut down the big mature trees that have the hollows and the really good habitat for birds and wildlife. So we're also going to up the protection in the Tree Protection Act and make sure that developers can't simply remove those mature trees. That's a pretty important part of it. We want to make sure that there are government appointed arborists who are independently assessing those mature trees prior to the DA process. So there's a lot of strong protections in there, as well as some really good resourcing. The other day, we also announced a new program to build 5,000 nesting boxes as an emergency measure to help our wildlife that has sort of fled in to the city from the bushfire affected regions, to make sure that they have somewhere to raise their chicks and raise their young right now. So we're actually thinking about this quite hard. We're obviously very committed to the 30% tree canopy coverage targets, and we are keen to roll those out, but we want to make sure that we're managing an entire urban forest, not merely managing different plants in different areas and failing to connect the dots and failing to make a proper year-round habitat that links up.
Thanks, Jo. I'm going to Mick and then Elizabeth.
Thanks, Helen. Well, you know, as Environment Minister, I've added to our network of reserves, most recently the addition of Franklin grasslands. And I've also been working with EPSDD to explore what other areas of ecological significance could be added to our parks and reserves as well. I gave the example before about the steps we took in Throsby to protect woodlands. And in fact, almost 80% of the territory's woodlands are already in reserves. So that's good. To build on this work in the environment space, we've committed, of course, to a 30% tree canopy target, planting 450,000 additional trees over the next 25 years, as well as protecting the existing canopy as well. And some of the policies I mentioned earlier of developing a Canberra-wide landscape strategy and growing our network of green spaces would also support biodiversity. I think we need to remember too that according to the 2016 Commonwealth State of the Environment report, 98% of Canberrans already live 4 to 5 minutes walk from a green space. Now, the Canberra Liberals have promised a 10-minute walk to a green space, so I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that.
Elizabeth, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. And I think most people will have heard about our 1 million tree policy. And we think that, yes, it is ambitious, but it is necessary, because under this ACT Labor Greens government, we have seen tree canopy go backwards, and we want to make sure that we address that. There's no doubt, and especially in this group, I know that there's no doubt about the importance of trees to our environment, but we want to make sure that we listen to the experts and ensure that we plant the right species in the right locations to protect our biodiversity corridors and for a sustainable city. And that's what we are committed to.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. We're going to step outside the ACT a little bit, and I noticed somebody else has also put this question in the chat bar. Elizabeth, I'm going to go to you first, just so that you can see it coming. So the next question is about the federal environment law. Currently, the federal government has got legislation tabled to commence a process of negotiation with state and territory governments to devolve the decision-making powers under the EPBC. This process has commenced without funding or without national environment standards set in place. So the question is, what is your party's position on federal government handing over its environmental responsibilities to the states and territories? And how will the ACT manage conflicts of interest if this were to go ahead, where the territory government is both a proponent of a project and also the approver for impacts on matters of national environmental significance? Thanks,
Helen. And you know, there obviously is a divulging of responsibility, if you like, but also the right. And the ACT government, I think, has come out and put on record that they see this review and reform as being part of an economic recovery strategy post-COVID, and so it'll be interesting to see what Mick has to say further about that. As we know, the devil is always in the detail, and we understand that the Federal Environment Minister has announced that there are negotiations happening. So we'll need to see what forms part of those negotiations. And I would like to think that whoever is in government after the 17th of October will ensure that the ACT's interests are pushed forward first and foremost, and we want to make sure that that's done. In terms of your question about the conflict, it is interesting because obviously ACT Labor has shown quite a lot of form in terms of not managing conflict when it comes to developments, and making sure that the public and the community's interests are placed before, and that will be something that we will be very, very acutely aware of.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to go to you, Joe.
Thanks, Ellen.
Sorry.
Look, the Greens are pretty concerned about this. We're probably a bit less tribal, I think, than the other parties on this one. We think that national ecological significance is actually a decision that should be made federally. We see some real conflict of interest issues in devolving that to the states and territories, including to the ACT. We've got a problem with letting the same agency who might be making profits from, developing land or selling land, or, in somehow other ways commodifying that land, and also making that decision. We don't like that. I don't think it is a good way for things to be done. We think the federal government should be making sound ecological decisions in the interests of the entire nation. We've actually been exploring some better environmental legal protections that we do have control over. So last week we announced that we want to expand the Human Rights Act to enshrine a right to a healthy environment for people. We announced that in a specific environmental context of lead in schools, but I think it will have quite a large impact in legal protection for the environment down here. And we're we're exploring other legal options for this, because I think it's a real problem, frankly. And after the 17th of October, Helen, I think I'll be coming to you and having a chat to you if we're successful in getting a few seats about how we're going to manage this.
Great, thanks, Joe. I'll go to you, Mick.
Thanks. Well, my starting position is that we need to strengthen the Commonwealth laws and frameworks. I'm not interested in signing up to something that weakens protections, and also that we need to account for climate change in the federal EPBC Act. The Chief Minister was very clear on this point where we submitted our views to Professor Samuel. Climate change is accounted for in our planning system, and the planning review underway is the opportunity to build on our work in that area. And lastly, I think we need to trust our statutory officers. I know firsthand the Chief Planner and the Conservator of Flora and Fauna take their statutory responsibilities very seriously, and it's important to have independent decision makers and to trust them as well. As I said at the beginning, we need to be evidence-based during this.
Thanks, Mick. I mean, maybe I could come back to you and just drill down into that a little bit. Are there concerns that if some of these decision-making powers were to devolve to the ACT, which is a fairly small jurisdiction, and acknowledging that those statutory office holders have a statutory obligation under the law and would have, and other people may have another statutory obligation if the powers were devolved, albeit that it can be very, very difficult to make independent decisions when you're operating in a particular context. Do you think that it's probably a safer bet to leave that decision-making process for approvals with the Commonwealth?
Yes, that's our position. I think that we need to enhance the Commonwealth laws, and we need to ensure we can strengthen those along the way.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to throw to another Commonwealth related issue. Geoff Robertson is the President of Friends of Grasslands. Geoff, are you there? I think he's not, because I think I can see his ceiling with a ceiling vent. So I might continue on. I'm going to throw to Ian Falconer, who is a board member.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, there you are. Hello, Geoff. Sorry.
All right, I had some problems getting onto the session.
Okay, Geoff, over to you.
Okay, so just a couple of things. Congratulations, Helen. I think this is running very well, and I just wish the candidates all the best in the upcoming election. However, I want to ask this question, and we send some background material through to you, so you should have some ideas about it. Defence Housing Australia is proposing a housing development at Lawson North, which is the former naval transmitting station. And that proposal will destroy large areas of critically endangered natural temperate grasslands and grassy woodlands. Would your party in government speak out against any proposed development, and what actions would you take to prevent such a development from proceeding?
Thanks, Geoff. We are over to you, Mick. You can, first off.
Thanks, Geoff. And can I thank Geoff for his advocacy in grasslands? He's done some fantastic work over the term. I think we need to seek advice from the ecologists and experts in EPSDD and see what action we could take. We probably need to develop our urban infill, as we've said, but not in areas of ecological significance. I think it's important that we take time to carefully look at where developments can occur and undertake the studies needed to understand the impacts as well. So I don't think this development has yet undergone the EPBC Act assessment. So when it does, I'll be open to working with officials to put in a submission. Of course, that's if ACT Labor is re-elected.
Thanks, Mick. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Helen. And funnily enough, I'm going to agree with Mick on this one. So we need to ensure that, of course, the ACT's interests are first and foremost taken into consideration. There are no easy answers here, because if there were, then it would just be a no-brainer. But with the added complexity of what's happening with the EPBC Act, we're not sure the timings of how things will go, but we need to rely on the experts to ensure that all the necessary assessments in terms of our protection of our environment is done. And if there is a need to, then we will, of course, lobby. But we know that there has to be a balance between urban development or even development under the defence housing, and also managing the environmental protections that we need for ACT land. And I'm confident that if a Canberra Liberals government is in, that we will be in a good position to be able to negotiate with, discuss with the Commonwealth about how we move forward.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Over to you, Joe.
We didn't wait to get elected. We've already started lobbying on this one. I've written on behalf of the Greens to Barry Jackson, the Managing Director of DHA. He hasn't yet responded, but we do not think that development should go ahead. And that is the position we hold, and we will do what we can to make sure that development does not go ahead. Simple.
Okay, thanks, Joe. All right, I'm going to throw to a question from the floor that somebody has put forward around fire management in Namadgi. Obviously a topic of great interest. 80% of Namadgi National Park burned in this year's bushfire. Can candidates guarantee that the remaining 20% should remain as a refuge for surviving plants, animals and insects, i.e. no burning for 5 years to allow the recovery of precious unique ecosystems and retain the character of bush capital? There's another question around bushfire, which I'm going to add in because we probably won't get back to this topic. Given the huge destruction from summer bushfires and the risk of bushfire increasing with climate change, do you think that there should be more controlled burns, or can we minimise bushfires in other ways? So those two questions are almost coming at it from different angles, but I think the question to throw to you broadly is around what your party's views are on ongoing bushfire management, but potentially both in Namadgi, within Namadgi, and also within the Canberra Nature Park. I will go to you first, Joe.
Brilliant, the easy one. Look, we have a lot of respect for cultural practices. Our repairing the land package sets out 10 new Ngunnawal Ranger positions that will use cultural land management, including cool burns. We think that is a very good way to go. We will obviously take an evidence-based expert approach to any of that, and we will listen to the advice. I think cool burns are a very good idea. We have in our stated policy that we want to protect long unburnt sites of Namadgi from prescribed burns, 8% of it, and that can be done, according to the experts, by doing cool burns in the adjacent areas. So I think there is a way through to both do a bit of protection and also a lot of safe cool burns in the area around. But I think really this is an area where you need to be making sure you get the right people in with the right resourcing, doing the right job, and that is the best way to manage it. The flip side, of course, is real action on climate change is the only long-term way we are going to deal with these problems, and we are doing a lot of work in that space. We've got a declared state of climate change emergency, 100% renewable electricity. We have got a lot of very ambitious climate change policies. We are electrifying our transport. We are shifting people into different modes of transport. So we are very strongly committed to real action on the climate, which will address the bigger problem.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to go to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Helen. And I think, you know, that for every Australian, you know, let alone Canberran who went through the summers that we did, will understand the devastating effects of the fires. And we want to make sure that we do take an evidence-based approach, listen to the experts. And I think that there's no one solution, because if there was, then, you know, we'd be sort of gung-ho going for it. So we need to ensure that we do find that balance. We need to ensure that we do listen to the experts about the control burns, but at the same time ensuring the sustainable long-term vision for, you know, the majestic places like Namadgi.
And to you, Mick.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I agree with Joe in saying that climate change is really affecting our summers and our bushfire seasons. They're longer and hotter. We know that. The experts are telling us that as we plan our BOPs for the years ahead. I will say that ecological importance is accounted for in this area when they're looking at managing load, and the rangers who know and love our environment are the ones that actually do the burns. They do take into account, of course, that impact, and they've been working really closely with our traditional custodians when we're doing those cultural burns as well. So I'd say ultimately it's really something that politicians shouldn't be interfering with. We need to leave it to the experts.
Great, thanks, Mick. I think a lot of people might agree with you on that one. Okay, I'm now going to throw to one of our board members, Ian Falconer, who's going to ask a question of our candidates. Ian, are you there?
You switched off? Mute off, that's fine. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ian.
We're all interested in the natural environment, and one of the components of it is water quality, which is of concern particularly to me. We're interested in our lakes being good for recreation and our creeks being clean. Now, one of the problems we have in the ACT is we have a lot of urban development going on all the time with a lot of construction work, a lot of sites. And sediment and runoff from building sites can impact our creeks and our lakes very badly. And with the recent rain we've had, if you've just looked at any of our lakes, you'll find they're full of mud. Now, one of the problems is the compliance to regulations governing sediment control. When a survey was done of this, it was found to be largely absent. The question is straightforward then. Do the candidates support additional funding for the EPA, who's responsible for compliance, to enhance regulation and compliance on building sites with respect to sediment?
Thanks, Ian. Elizabeth, I'm going to throw that one over to you.
Thanks, Helen, and thank you for that question. There is actually a lot of feedback that I'm getting in the community about the lack of enforcement, and in terms of when there are breaches, especially when it comes to breaches that may impact our environment, and a lot of them come from the planning area. So we need to ensure that, yes, the EPA is well supported to do its job, but we also need to make sure that they are being given the right leadership and the expectation. We know that, for example, if you look at the EPA and its I suppose hampering of being able to enforce things like the pop-up tip over at Hume, you know, it's been going on for quite a while now. We need to look at why and what is stopping the EPA from being able to enforce and take action against people who are clearly breaching environmental regulations. So we need to look at it globally.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to go to Joe next.
Thanks, Ellen. Look, I come from a waste background. I run a recycling company and I've worked in the waste industry for a while. And I definitely understand the need for better EPA enforcement. We do support better resourcing for the EPA, who will be regulating our waste and recycling facilities and our sediment runoff into our waterways. There's a lot of tensions that have popped up in Canberra as we build more and as we try and recycle or manage that waste, and we're not really doing it well at the moment. So we will be launching a recycling strategy that will be dealing with that shortly, and we definitely support better EPA enforcement and resourcing to make sure that they are imposing the right standards. We've also launched, we don't just talk about land management, we've launched a repairing the waterways package, which is a whole lot of infrastructure in the Healthy Waterways program, and a whole lot of funding for the community groups and the managers who are making sure that we have high quality water and that the water that leaves Canberra is in as good a condition as the water that enters Canberra. So I think we're quite deeply committed to resourcing that, both on the regulatory side and also on the improving the waterways that we have side, to make sure we get a better outcome.
Thanks, Jo. Mick?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I think a review of the EPA is very important. We know they do a great job, but it doesn't hurt to ensure that we've got the settings right in this area. And I think how and when the EPA engage in the planning and building process is important too. So we can look at this through a review, but more importantly through the planning review, really work together to see the best strategic place in the process that EPA and other statutory bodies should be involved as well. And I'm also keen to explore how we can improve our waterways. We've invested quite a bit over the last number of years, and still more to come as well. And something I hope we can continue working with our catchment groups with if we're re-elected.
Thanks, Mick. Just sticking on water for a little bit longer. One of the things that was outlined in the climate change strategy with the Living Infrastructure Plan was the 30% permeable surfaces target. Probably hasn't had as much of a discussion as perhaps the 30% tree canopy target, but is really important, and particularly in a city where we're seeing a lot of urban development happening, both in the public realm but also the private realm, where houses are being built, taking up larger footprints on blocks, and where surfaces are being paved for other purposes. What are the policies that you might put in place to increase permeable surfaces across the urban area, both on public and private lands, and also so that we can actually slow the movement of stormwater across our urban lakes, across our urban landscape and into our stormwater system? Jo, I'll go to you first.
Slow the flow. Look, we're pretty keen on enforcing, making sure we reach those targets on 30% tree canopy coverage and 30% permeable surface coverage. We are very committed to resourcing those areas properly. We have already called for some legislative changes to the Tree Protection Act to make sure we're removing less trees. We've done a lot of planning law reform through Caroline Lakuta's work to sort of put the brakes on some of the development that's not happening in the right way. We want to prohibit wholesale landscape clearing in new suburbs. We want to make sure that developers don't clear and fell as freely as they do. We want to continue the Healthy Waterways project, and we've launched a big package to make sure that we've got enough resourcing to do that, and to make sure that our catchment groups are resourced well enough. We love all the wetlands and the swales and the ponds that have been built. We want to roll more of those out. And look, we're just quite, I love our lakes. I'm quite committed recreationally to making sure that we improve our waterways. And I'm also quite committed to it from a climate change perspective, because we know that these are great mitigation strategies. We know we're going to counter the heat island effect with trees and water, and we really need to be thinking about what Canberra's going to look like in 30 years time if we don't take the right actions now.
Thanks, Jo. I'll go to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Helen. And, you know, that we believe that making sure that we increase permeable surfaces and access to green spaces is, of course, going to help and is a sensible approach when it comes to heat mitigation and stormwater runoff. There's no doubt about that. You know, so, but part of this, I think the bigger overarching bit is actually making sure that we review our planning system. And that is something that is going to take a whole lot of effort, because we know that the planning system currently is not working and it needs a complete overhaul. And making sure that we take into consideration these important aspects is going to be a huge part of that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Over to you, Mick.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Well, we have that target in the Living Infrastructure Plan that's been released by government, and we know that there's more work needed to understand how to achieve the target. I think that EPSTD have been giving some thought on how to achieve this. Of course, some of the work is reflected in DV 369, which is still progressing with EPSTD, and we couldn't finalise the DV this term because the community needed more time to consider it. And of course, the consultations were impacted by COVID-19. So public consultations were extended, and hopefully if we're re-elected, we can continue to work on that.
Okay, thanks, Mick. I'm going to go to one of the questions that's been put in the chat bar again. So this is not one that you'll see coming. So the question is, given the significant reduction in the numbers of insects across the board and their critical role in the ecosystem, their role as pollinators and foods for birds and other animals, would you support restricting pesticide use in the ACT, except under exceptional circumstances, such as termite control, as some cities in Europe have become pesticide free? Mick, I'll go to you first on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I've had a good chat to our pollinators over the many times that we've had the discussions on Bee Week, and they have put to me this proposal. I think I'd need to get advice from our experts before I've made any commitment, but if there's a way of doing it where we can control those invasive pests in another way while still promoting the pollinators, then yes, I'd be all for it.
I'll go to you, Elizabeth.
No worries. Thank you, Helen, and thanks for that question. I think you do need to find a balance, because obviously there is a critical role for pollinators and all the insects that we have in our environment, and they do play a big role. But at the same time, it's difficult to say that's it, you can't use pesticides at all when, you know, people are trying to deal with pests such as weeds that do so much damage. So we will need to make sure that we take an evidence-based approach, listen to the experts about the best approach, because there are different ways, of course, of managing the pollinators and whether you can move them on or that type of thing. And we need to look at it from a holistic perspective and ensure that we approach it with a few different angles.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Joe?
Look, we think it would be appropriate to ban neonicotinoids. I'm reading that. I don't know if I'm saying it properly. So that's one of the pesticides that's really harmful for bees. That doesn't really, we don't need it. It doesn't have a role here. We would also like to reduce some of the other pesticides like glyphosate, and we'd take expert advice on that, but a lot of those can be reduced in a lot of situations. And then the flip side of that is we are trying to develop an urban forest strategy rather than simply individual trees, and we want to make sure that our government urban tree plantings and shrubs and all of our green spaces are selecting the right species that we've got year-round food for the bees, as well as not poisoning them as much as we do.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, I'm going to go to a question that I know is close to the heart of many people on the call, which is around community groups, who play a really important role helping to manage conservation areas across the territory. The Conservation Council has identified a number of organisations that could benefit from additional funding, which we've actually outlined in our election priorities document this year, including Landcare, the catchment groups that sit under Landcare, Canberra Nature Map, for example, and also Frogwatch. Funding could also help the community to better manage some of our urban native grasslands, such as at Umbagong Park and Isabella Pond, where we basically have urban landscapes, but we know that they have special qualities because they have grassland values or biodiversity values as well. So what support is your party going to offer to community groups at this election to support them in the important contribution that they make to protecting and enhancing our local environment? And sorry, lost track. Yes, I'll go to you first, Elizabeth, if that's all right.
No worries. Thanks, Helen. You're doing a really good job of keeping track, by the way, because I would have been confused. So the Canberra Liberals have already announced our commitment to funding land care in the catchment groups. And one of the feedbacks that we have received has been that it's difficult for our volunteer organisations to spend a lot of time doing what they do best if they are spending a lot of time going cap in hand year after year. And so one of the things that we have said and committed to is ensuring that they have funding certainty for a 4-year term, so they don't have to do that, that they can be free to spend their time doing what they do best. Of course, Landcare is not the only group that is doing so much work for our environment. I met with some volunteers from Park Care only recently and got to know even more about some of the great work that they're doing. So there are lots of volunteer organisations and, and the council has obviously identified a number of them that deserve a lot of support, and the Canberra Liberals government will look to ensure that we work with them to support them to do what they do best.
Great, thanks Elizabeth. I'll go to you, Mick. Mick, I think you're on mute still.
Oh yeah, there we go.
No worries.
Sorry, I just want to thank firstly all our wonderful volunteers across a range of organisations that help protect and enhance the environment. Also a big thank you for putting together the election arcs on behalf of the environment sector. It's unfortunate the federal Liberal government has taken an axe to the environmental programs and defunded these groups, but I'm proud ACT government was able to step up and provide support since the Liberal cuts. I'm not going to announce the full details tonight, but I'll draw attention to the statement in our election commitment that we've already released, which is fund ACT catchment groups and ACT wildlife to encourage more people to be more active and caring for nature. The campaign has another 4 weeks to go and we'll have a bit more to say on that. But of course, this would also build on the $2.3 million that we provided in January to support volunteers and programs like Waterwatch.
Great, thanks Mick. And Joe.
Look, I'm constantly blown away by the amazing volunteer work that goes on in Canberra. It's just fantastic. And it's amazing to be able to get out into those areas and chip in and help. It's such a great community building exercise as well. So look, we really value that. Our Repairing the Land package has set aside recurrent funds over 4 years. Elizabeth is quite right. We found the same thing. People shouldn't have to ask year on year on year. It wastes their time on grant applications. It means they can't plan properly. And it just, if you know it's worth funding, it's worth funding for long-term continuity. It doesn't need to be year on year. So our funding is all recurrent funding. And we want to fund all of those groups, the land care, park care, the catchment groups, the rural leaseholders, the urban park groups, the citizen science groups, Frogwatch and Waterwatch and Nature Mapper, the wildlife ACT and the wildlife carers. There's so many people doing so much valuable work that is just helping to restore Canberra.
Great, thanks Joe. Okay, I'm going to pitch a particular question to you, Mick, if that's okay with you. You may or may not know the answer. It's come from the floor, so and it's quite specific, so feel free to take it on notice. But actually, no, it's for everybody. But it says, given the importance of nesting and denning tree hollows to vulnerable birds like the brown tree creeper and the glossy black cockatoo, and vulnerable mammals like the greater glider, what action is being taken or is planned to assess the impact of the 1925s on old growth hollow trees? I think that's probably, I'll direct that to you, Mick, first, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, we did release the recovery plan for Namadgi National Park, which of course looks at how we can best support our native animals, plant species. And I've been out actually talking to the community about it over the last couple of weeks. It's a big investment for us to do, but it's a really important investment, I think. And of course, we'll work with the experts and of course, our volunteers and those in this group to ensure that we can promote that and make sure that we get the habitat that we need into the future.
Sorry, I'm busy chatting away. Did Joe or Elizabeth did you want to respond to that question, or are you happy to move on to the next question? I wasn't sure if you'd like to go to that one. Put your hand up if you'd like to respond. Yep, Joe, okay.
Just briefly, a lot of what I've already said tonight, but as well as funding 10 new additional Indigenous ranger positions in the Namadgi, we want to turn Canberra into a city sanctuary for wildlife. We know that a lot of wildlife has fled into Canberra as a result of those fires. So that's why we want to protect the old trees we have, and we want to build 5,000 nesting boxes through AMC detainees to really make sure that there's some emergency measures happening right now.
Thanks, Joe. Elizabeth, did you want to comment on that one?
No, not really. I don't really have much further to add, except to say, of course, that we'll listen to the experts as well and see what we need to do, because, you know, the nesting boxes do need play a significant role, and we want to make sure that, you know, we can do what we can in that space.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. My apologies. I'm just going to see if I can pull one more question before we throw to the candidates for a wrap-up comment. So just excuse me while I quickly scan for something that we haven't touched on yet. I might just try to bundle a concept. We talked earlier about urban densification and the expansion of the urban footprint. I wonder if candidates could just outline how you would go about prioritising areas that are appropriate for urban infill. Urban infill's obviously been quite a contentious issue at this election. And what are the sorts of things that you would be looking for in terms of biodiversity values that you'd want to sort of seek to protect within the urban footprint at the moment when thinking about urban infill? And before I throw that question to you, I think I'm grabbed a few concepts there. Yep, that'll do it for the moment. Joe, I'll throw to you first, and then I'll go to Elizabeth and then to Mick.
Yeah, look, that is a big question, Helen. Canberra's population is changing. The Greens don't want to see us continue to build up into, you know, new habitat. That obviously means that means different development within our city limits. We've been working in the planning space as hard as we can for a pretty long time. It's a big job reviewing our planning laws. We've released some new policies ahead of the election. We want some more genuine community consultation. I think that will inherently mean that we get better development. We've introduced some climate change triggers and high quality triggers on the types of developments that we have, because we want more sustainable developments and better built developments as we build up. We want better tree protection in our tree protection legislation, so that we're thinking about this a bit harder. So it's hard to summarise, isn't it? We want better planning with better genuine consultation and sort of more genuine decision making about what we do, rather than things just popping up in different places in a fairly haphazard way. But it's really important to get this right now as Canberra grows, because otherwise we're not going to grow in a way that we like.
Thank you, Joe. I've totally forgotten who I said was going to be next, but I'll throw to you next, Elizabeth.
No worries. Thanks, Helen. There is no doubt that Canberra's population is changing, and we need to find that balance, because the Canberra Liberals believe that we do need to provide Canberra families with choice when it comes to housing. So whilst we need to ensure that that is there, we also have to make sure that that is done in a sustainable way that will protect our environment for our future generations. Because one of the reasons that people do choose Canberra to be their home is because of our proud heritage as the bush capital, is because of our green spaces and the clean air, and we want to make sure that that's available for our future generations as well. So it is about finding that balance, and that's why we've come up with our policy of planting and caring for 1 million trees, as well as our green space guarantee.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll throw to you, Mick.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Look, this is really important, I think. Look, we've been very firm on very little growth in greenfields. We've looked at how housing can be built along transport corridors and in urban centres. That's really important for densification. But we need, of course, to reduce the footprint in ecological areas. And the Canberra Liberals, of course, through Mark Parton and Mr Coe, have said they don't support infill. They want urban sprawl. And their entire economic magic pudding is based on delivering single dwellings to pay for the promises. And I think that's policy made up that threatens the environment.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to wrap up the questions from there. I did offer all of the candidates an opportunity to have a couple of minutes to wrap up tonight. I'm really sorry to all of the people who put questions who weren't able to ask them. As you can imagine, it's quite difficult coordinating all of the questions together, but we try to do our best to put them forward to the candidates. So I'm going to throw to the candidates just to see if they'd like to wrap up with make a wrap-up comment this evening, perhaps reflecting on what we've discussed, or anything else that you haven't had the opportunity potentially to talk about tonight. Mick, I wonder if you'd like to kick off.
Yes, thanks, Helen, and thanks for everybody for being part of this tonight. It's been quite exciting, I think. Look, this election will come down to a handful of votes in each seat, and it's a choice about Canberra's future. There's no going back should the Liberals be elected. 4 years of a Liberal government will see urban sprawl that devastates Canberra's ecology and biodiversity. They've got fig leaves as environment policy. Their shadow minister hasn't moved one motion on the environment in the Assembly, and has questioned the reliability of renewables and battery storage as well. And we also know, of course, when the Liberals promise cuts to revenue, no matter what they may say, it will be cuts to the environment, cuts to EPSTD, and cuts to public servants. Just ask our friends in Landcare and the catchment groups about what happened under the current federal Liberal government. In contrast, Labor's invested in the environment. We've continued this during our worst economic crisis in generations in COVID, and we've supported jobs by enhancing our environment through projects in the Lower Cotter catchment and, of course, hiring more rangers. If we're re-elected, Labor will build on the investments that we've made in government, and we don't just talk about the environment, we act. ACT Labor ministers and MLAs are environmentalists. So thanks everybody for the hard work and passion that you put into your work. And I sincerely hope we'll have the privilege of returning and working with you all soon.
Thank you, Mick. Elizabeth, I'm going to throw to you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to the Conservation Council for putting this on, and thank you to all the participants who've taken the time to tune in as well. I hope that you found the evening very, very interesting. The Canberra Liberals have a great positive plan for the future of our city. We all know and love our city, and that was very evident from the questions that were coming up tonight and also the pre-prepared ones. And of course, one of the best things about Canberra is our proud heritage as a bush capital. Canberra Liberals want to make sure that we make Canberra the best place to live, work and raise a family. We want to take the cost of living pressures off Canberrans, and we want to make sure that we create a sustainable future for everyone, including, of course, our future generations. So you do have a choice this election, and do you want the same old tired Labor government? And I will allow Labor's record to speak for itself when it comes to their management of our planning system and everything else under the sun, education, health, transport, you name it. Or do you want a fresh new government that is going to bring fresh ideas and a real positive plan for Canberra? Thank you very much again, and thanks again, Helen, for hosting, because I know that it's not an easy job to keep us all in line, and you did a brilliant job.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's so much easier when you can't see what's happening at this end. So I'm going to throw to you, Jo.
Thanks, Helen. Look, Helen, I'm not an MLA. I'm a candidate. I'm a climate change activist. I run a recycling company called Send and Shred, which I set up with the Green Shed. and I run a climate change project called the Carbon Diet. So I'm an environmentalist. I've actually marched with a lot of people in this Zoom at various points over the years. I'm really proud to be part of the Greens. We've put together a really well thought out, well considered package in our Repairing the Land and Repair Waterways environmental initiatives. They're all on our website. I'd love to hear any feedback you've got on those packages. We really, really value the urban environment and the natural environment that we have. We're really, really keen to resource it properly and treat it properly. And we are really keen to make sure that we resource our Indigenous, cultural land managers and our community groups properly so that they can do the work that they are doing so well. We are also extremely concerned about climate change, as I think is probably everybody here tonight, and we are very, very keen to make sure we continue to take real action on the climate. We're seeing in the ACT there are world leading steps that are happening and Australian leading steps that are happening here. So I'm deeply committed to make sure that we continue to pull the government in the right direction and make sure that we get some of that real climate action, which is actually going to go to the heart of almost every problem we've talked about tonight.
Thanks so much, Jo. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to wrap up this evening. I just would like to remind all of you on the call, I think most of you on the call are great supporters of the Conservation Council, and many of you have been involved in developing the policies that we pulled together in preparation for this election. We've actually got around 80 to 90 pages of policy documents from which we drew the election priorities document, and we pulled those out for the candidates to have as a guide to the things that we thought were the most important in the ACT in 2020. But will also form the basis for our advocacy work going forward over the next 4 years, no matter who is returned to government. So that document, if you haven't seen it, is available on our website. And we've also got some great little action sheets that if people would like to get campaigning, if you go onto our website, you can download some action sheets that you can use to talk to your candidates, your local candidates, about the issues that they support at this election, and that will guide you towards the things that the environment community has identified as being priorities. So that's all available on our website. A big thank you to those of you who donated at the door. When we have these events online, our door is a rather electronic door, and we do ask for a donation at the door if you can possibly make one. And we're often quite blown away by the contributions that people make when you register for the event. So thank you so much for that. As you know, we try to churn out quite a lot of work on a fairly small budget, and we do appreciate the support both in the policy work and the volunteer work that we do, but also financially from our supporters. So thank you for that. I do want to just take the opportunity of having the microphone to spruik our online spring dinner. As you would all know, we've had to cancel World Environment Day dinner this year due to COVID, and we made a decision that that wasn't a good event to proceed with even in November, which is when we postponed it to. But we have just released early bird tickets for our online spring dinner this week, which may sound a little quirky, but if you register, we've got 2 hours of online environmentally related entertainment. And we will also deliver a beautiful fresh hamper to your house with bottles of wine and drinks as you would like. So we would like to encourage you all to have an environmental gathering with your friends at your home. Make sure it's COVID safe and that it fits with all the COVID guidelines that are in place. But it's our biggest fundraising event of the year, and it would be a great way to catch up with your friends that you might not have seen much of this year, or your member groups. So check out the website and have a look at the event. It will include our annual environment awards as well. So on that note, I'd like to say a big thank you again to our candidates for coming along tonight. No matter your views, your opinions, or your parties or your policies, running for a public office is no mean feat and takes a great deal of commitment, a great deal of time, and a great deal of energy. Being in public office does as well. So thank you for the contribution that you make. Happy campaigning and all the best for over the next 4 weeks. And if we don't talk to you between now and then, we will certainly see you after October the 17th. A quick reminder that polls do open on next Monday, the 28th of September. So for those who like to vote early, vote often, as I often say, just remember you're only allowed to vote early, not often. So good luck, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. And if you would like to join us for our climate change and urban sustainability event next Tuesday, we look forward to seeing you at that as well. Thank you very much.